Hello, and welcome to the BYU Family History Library webinar series. We're glad you could join us today. I'm Anna Allred, and I'll be your host for this webinar. If you have technical difficulties during the webinar, please use the chat box, and I can address your concerns. You are welcome to use the chat box during the webinar for comments, insights, and questions. However, all questions will be addressed at the end of the presentation. Our next webinar is on July 21st with Kurt Witcher on the effective use of the Allen County Public Library's Genealogy Center. If you would like to access a previous webinar, please visit our webinar index on our website or search on our YouTube channel. All of our webinars are recorded and uploaded by the following Monday for your convenience. We also post links to recordings and other updates on our Facebook and Twitter accounts. For today's webinar, we are pleased to hear from Kathryn Grant, who will be giving a presentation on best practices for working in FamilySearch's shared family tree. And then Kathryn Grant. After years on the sidelines, Kathryn began doing family history. Somewhat to her surprise, she discovered that she loved it. Her specialty is helping new family historians find success and maybe even avoid some of the mistakes she's made. Kathryn teaches Sunday classes at the BYU Family History Library and presents at other family history events. Her column on family history ran in the Malibu Times for about a year and is still available online. In addition, she's a regular contributor to the FamilySearch blog. Kathryn works as a technical writer and instructional designer with a focus on usability and process improvement. Her current work assignment includes developing training using on mobile devices. Besides family history, she loves uplifting music, thought-provoking books, and spring lilacs. And now, Kathryn, if you're ready, we'll turn the time over to you.
Wonderful. Anna, thank you so much. Let me go ahead and share my screen here. Okay, well, welcome everybody. We are so glad to have you with us today for this webinar. I'm really excited about this topic. I think it's such an important one. So we will be talking about best practices for working in FamilySearch's shared family tree. Let's take a look at what's on the schedule for today. First of all, we're going to get on the same page by talking about or by answering the question, what is a shared tree? Then we'll talk about what we need to understand about working in a shared tree. And then finally, we'll review 5 best practices for working in a shared tree. So I wanted to put up front a couple of caveats before we get started. The views expressed in this webinar are definitely my own. They're not the views of, or they don't necessarily reflect those of BYU or FamilySearch, yet they do reflect my own experience and observations. So they are carefully considered. And for those of you who have watched some of my other webinars, you know that I don't often talk about myself. I'm just kind of not comfortable with that. But for today, I felt like it might be helpful to tell you a little bit of my background as to why I've arrived at these opinions and recommendations that I'm going to share in the webinar today. So first of all, I wanted to be upfront that I am not an employee of BYU or FamilySearch. So I don't speak, as an authoritative source for them or anything like that. I'm also not a credentialed genealogist. I love genealogy and I've been doing it for many years, but I don't have a credential. I don't do it professionally. So I wanted to make that clear up front. Sometimes when you make recommendations, people will say things like, oh, well, you're just saying that because you're a professional genealogist. And I wanted to be clear up front that I'm not. But what I am is a teacher. So I've been a teacher for over 20 years. And I love it. I've taught all levels of people from children to adults at college. I got a master's degree in instructional design. Teaching is really my passion. I think that teaching it's the way we change the world, right? I so appreciate good teachers in my life because they've changed my life. And I hope to be a good teacher in turn for other people who may want to learn the types of things that I'm teaching. I'm also a technical writer, which is something I enjoy very much. For those of you who may not be aware of what technical writers do, you don't have to write about technology to be a technical writer. It's basically any focused subject, but it does so happen that I do write about technology. So in my current job and past jobs, I have written, basically my job is to figure out how to use a complex software system and then explain it clearly to other people. And so as you can imagine, that skill developed on the job has been helpful in teaching about Family Search because it's definitely a very complex system necessarily because of the task it's trying to achieve. Then also, I'm a developer. I've done development professionally, so web development and other types of development. I've done that professionally and also do it on the side for myself. It's just something I enjoy. And that has also been very helpful in understanding what is possible on a website and what best user interfaces are and best user experiences, that kind of thing. And then finally, another thing that I've done a lot in my job is user research. And so I always want to be an advocate for users because there's so many products and systems out there, not just in family history, that maybe don't provide as good of a user experience as we would hope. And when we don't have a good user experience, it leads to errors and so forth. So I'm really, really passionate about understanding users and trying to help them have the best experience possible. And in this particular case, in Family Tree. So sometimes that's done through education. Sometimes it's done by giving feedback to Family Search and saying, hey, have you considered that there might be a better way to do this? So that, I hope, gives a little idea of my background that kind of contributes to the ideas that I'm going to share today. So let's all get on the same page and talk about what a shared tree is. And in order to do that, we need to go back in time to the days before computers. So for many hundreds of years, people kept, if they kept a family tree at all, they kept it on paper. And everybody kept their own family tree. And you might, if somebody in your family wanted a copy, if it was in the days before copy machines, you'd actually have to write it out by hand or, pay somebody to do that. But basically, everybody kept their own individual tree on paper. And then personal computers came along in the 1980s and people started keeping their own family trees in programs like PAF, Personal Ancestral File, or other similar programs. So this, for obvious reasons, is a step up from paper, but yet people were still just all having their own little individual trees. And yeah, it was easier to provide somebody with a copy. You could copy it onto a floppy disk and give it to your cousin or your grandparent or whatever, and they would be able to use it in their own genealogy program. But still, the model was that everybody had their own separate tree. Then the internet came along and people began keeping family trees online. For example, at Ancestry or MyHeritage, you can create your own tree online. And if you create a tree on one of those sites, you do have more options for sharing the tree. You can invite other registered users to contribute to your tree, or you can limit it so that people can just view and can't make changes. But essentially, the model is still pretty much the same. Somebody establishes a tree and it's their own tree. They own it. They add to it, they correct it, whatever. And it's separate from all these other trees that belong to other users. Then came Family Search, Family Tree, a truly revolutionary idea. The Family Search model is completely flipped on its head from the regular model. Instead of every single user having their own separate tree, Family Search provides a space where we can work together to create a shared tree. So a shared tree is kind of like a wiki. If you've used Wikipedia or other similar uh, sites that are built on wiki software, then you know that in a wiki, any user can change just about anything. But the flip side of that is that users who are part of that wiki community are expected to be careful and accurate. And that's the same thing in Family Search. It didn't used to be that way. For those of you who use the old system that was called new.familysearch.org, any user couldn't it still was a centralized tree, and that was an amazing revolutionary thing, as I mentioned. But before that time, any user couldn't really change anything. All they could do was add additional or even conflicting data, and they would note it as a separate opinion, for example. And so Family Search has actually demonstrated a great deal of trust in us as users to move to this family tree now, where not only is it shared, but users have permission to change just about anything in the tree. And so again, a very important part of being a citizen in the family tree community is that we're expected to be as careful and as accurate as possible. So there are great benefits to a shared tree, as you can imagine, and probably as a lot of you have experienced. So for one thing, you can connect with family all over the world. If they make a Family Search account, or if they're members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and they have a regular church account, they can connect to Family Search and they can connect with any other user in the world. This is an amazing thing. This was not possible with individual trees. Also, users can share research and collaborate on family lines. And again, you could do that to a limited extent with your individual tree, but not anywhere near the extent that you can do it on Family Search, where we're all looking at the same information. And then also, because we've got a shared tree, we can get hints and help from Family Search that would be impossible to get in other ways. But like everything in life, anytime you've got great benefits, you can also have some challenges, and that's true in Family Tree as well. So one of the biggest challenges is that a shared tree is a huge paradigm shift. And the way that I know that we haven't all made that shift is that I still see messages from people in Family Tree from time to time where they're upset because somebody else changed, quote, their tree. So I've seen people say, stay out of my tree. So they don't understand why somebody could come in and attach a source or change a birth date or whatever on a person that they are related to, but they don't realize that every user can see every other person in Family Tree, with the exception of living people. They're protected by privacy. But any deceased person in the tree, any other user can see, and most of the time can contribute to those people. The only exception, the only time they can't contribute is when some records are locked. For instance, records of famous people like Elvis Presley or Mozart have been locked because so many people kept trying to change them. And finally, Family Search just had to say, you know what, we're just certain famous people, we're just going to lock those records, and other people, like, nobody can change those records. If you do see a change that needs to be made, you have to go through support to get it made. Okay, another challenge is that despite the fact that there's this expectation in a shared environment that everybody should be good citizens and be careful and accurate, the truth is not everybody is careful or accurate. But I will say, in my experience, most of the time, that is not intentional. In other words, people don't log into Family Tree and go, I'm just really going to mess things up. I don't want to be careful or accurate. No, most of the time they feel they are being careful and accurate, or they just haven't learned what is necessary to be careful and accurate when working in a shared tree. And then finally, this is probably the biggest challenge, is that because everybody can see everything in Family Tree except for living people, as we said, then one user's mistakes can affect many other users. I have seen over the years that it's getting somewhat better. In other words, I think users are learning to be more careful and they're making fewer mistakes, but we've still got a long way to go. And I do think it's going to continue to improve as people understand more what it means to work in a shared tree and what responsibility we have to all the other members of the shared family tree community. So even with the challenges, a shared tree really is the way to go because it's the best way to create an accurate tree of the whole human family, which is FamilySearch's goal. And overall, Family Tree does keep getting better and better. Did you know that there are now over 13 million Family Search users? When you think about that, that is incredible. And a fair percentage of those people could be your relatives. In fact, there's got to be some in there that are your relatives, and maybe a great many of those people are your relatives. So this just underscores the importance of being a good member of the Family Search community. And so it raises our $100,000 question, which we're going to answer in this webinar today, or at least try to provide a good answer. How can we work effectively in the shared family tree and be good family tree citizens? Well, that leads us to the next section is what are some important things we need to understand in order to work effectively in the shared family tree? There are just a couple, but they are very, very important. One is that I feel that it's so important to understand where the data came from that shows up in Family Tree. Well, back in the very, very beginning days when it wasn't even called Family Tree, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints started collecting temple ordinance records, and that information became the forerunner, if you will, of Family Tree. And then also as extraction was done, those records were also included. In fact, many of them were used for temple ordinances. And for those of you who may not be familiar with the extraction program, it's basically just the old indexing program. And then also information from church membership records is fed into Family Tree. And then finally, individual users can just make contributions to Family Tree. They may, in the old days, people used GEDCOM files. I think we're hopefully moving away from that. The old 4-generation programs, people would submit information that way. Today, people do a lot of manual submission, or not really submission, but they'll type names manually into Family Tree. But the interesting thing about each of these sources is that ultimately they all come from plain old ordinary people like you and me. So for instance, who supplied the names for temple work to be done? Well, ordinary members of the church. Who did the extraction? Volunteers, ordinary people. Who contributed the information? Who gave the information to the ward clerk that ended up on the church membership record? Ordinary people. I even asked one of my friends one time whose husband was a ward clerk. I said, when you, like, suppose you have a new baby or you move into a ward or whatever, you get baptized, maybe you're a convert and get baptized. Do you have to provide any documentation to the ward clerk, like your birth certificate or your social security number or something that proves that the information you're supplying is correct? And she said, no, not at all. The ward clerk just believes people. And most of the time that is going to be accurate. But sometimes there are mistakes, like the ward clerk who put my grandfather's name in church membership records did it incorrectly. So again, the point is that all this information comes from ordinary people like you and me, and the same thing for user submissions. Well, let's take a look at some of these ordinary people. So I'll just share some what we call personas in user research, and those are basically just um, hypothetical people, but they're based on a number of real people. So One person that contributes to Family Tree is Sandra. She's a busy mom and she's an intermediate genealogist. We've also got Kyle. He's a teenager. He's very tech savvy, but he's new to family history. But he also wants to figure it out himself. He doesn't want someone lecturing to him or babysitting him or anything like that. He'd rather plunge in and make the mistakes and learn from it and move forward that way. Then we've got Jonathan. He's recovering from a traumatic brain injury, actually. This does represent a friend it's actually one of my consultant friends is helping a person who had a traumatic brain injury. And he's been somewhat impaired, but the one driving force in his life and the one thing that brings him joy is he wants to do family history. So she helps him with that. But this persona also represents anybody who has challenges, people struggling with dementia, people that face other challenges that might make it more difficult for them to work in the shared family tree, and yet they have a strong desire to, and they should be allowed to. That's like, it's not anybody's place to keep people out of the family tree just because they may be struggling in some certain area. Then we have Sweet Lenore. She's about 80 years old. She's a traditional genealogist, so she knows all the old ways of doing things, but she's not too certain about computers. Honestly, she has a hard time turning it on. She always has her husband do it. And so she loves genealogy, but again, you can see that this would have an impact on her contributions in the shared tree. Then we've got Michelle. Now, she's a longtime professional genealogist, very much knows what she's doing. Pretty much everything she enters in Family Tree is perfect. Not many of us are a Michelle. And then we've got Tim. He's a new convert. He's very comfortable with technology. He uses it on his job, and he has done some family history, but he wants to do more. Well, what do you notice about all these people and all this delightful variety? Well, the quality of the information that is contributed by these people is going to vary widely. And I want to be very clear here that I really believe that's a good thing. I don't think we want a family tree that is, for instance, only reserved to professional genealogists or only reserved to perfect people. We want everybody to contribute. But then that's why we have webinars like this, because you don't get into the tree just automatically knowing what to do. And honestly, it's kind of hard sometimes to find information that will answer your questions and give you the guidance that you're seeking to work in the shared tree. So we have to be patient with each other and try to follow best practices that will help us be good community citizens. One other thing, this is the last item in this section that I wanted to be clear about. And this is a big switch from the time when from the scenario where we own our own tree. A shared tree does not work well as a sandbox. So what do I mean by a sandbox? A sandbox is a place where you can enter questionable information. You can put stuff that you want to verify later that isn't complete. You can put stuff that you think may downright be wrong, but you don't want to lose it. And so you keep it in there, but you have a note that you're going to verify it, whatever it is. In our personal trees, that was a common way of working in a personal tree because no one else saw it. And so it was a great place for a sandbox. But a shared tree, not so much. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is that in the shared tree, as you may have noticed, when you look at your family members that are already in the tree, Family Search will very often give you record hints and possible duplicates for those people, but they rely on accurate information. If we give them inaccurate information, Family Search is going to give us inaccurate record hints. The other reason, we've kind of alluded to this already, is that other users also rely on accurate information. So if I enter some faulty stuff or some questionable stuff in Family Tree, other users don't read my mind, right? They don't know that I'm still trying to prove that. They jump in and they go, oh, she found my a fourth great grandfather. This is such great news. Now I'm going to start building my tree out on this person that I couldn't find before. And so, but if I've put it in wrong, then they're building on a totally wrong foundation. So that's why our shared family tree is not a good place for questionable or badly incomplete data, because it's going to probably trip up other users. So those are important things to understand about working in a shared tree. Now let's talk about 5 best practices for working in the shared family tree. And again, these are my recommendations, well considered, I hope, but I don't want anybody to leave this webinar going, oh, she said this was what family search, this was family search policy, or you must do it this way, or you're a bad genealogist. Not at all. I offer these suggestions in the spirit of collaboration and love, and just the hope that this will be helpful to you in working in the shared family tree. So the first thing is verify everything. Don't take it for granted that any information is correct, because again, remember, we've got all kinds of users working in the tree. And even though you look and you see, quote, your line or your family in the tree, everybody else can see it, and probably dozens or maybe even hundreds of your relatives could be working on that tree at the same time. So you might hear myths, though, about that might lead you to believe that it's not necessary to verify the data that you see in Family Tree. So one myth that I've heard multiple times is that Family Search or the church has validated all the names in Family Tree. Excuse me. In fact, one of my friends was helping somebody, and she started to add somebody to Family Tree, and the person she was helping was shocked, completely shocked. She's like, "You're not supposed to be adding things to Family Tree. The church manages that." And so my consultant friend had to explain, well, actually, no. Family Tree, all the information in there is contributed by users, and it is not validated by anybody, not by Family Search or not by the church or not by some genealogical committee or anything like that. It's contributed by ordinary users like you and me. The other myth that goes around is that users, a way of stating this is that any name shared with a temple must have been verified. In fact, I had a student in one of my classes kind of go back and forth with me about that when I tried to explain that there was no verification that it had been done on names submitted to the temple. And he said, no, I am sure that users, if they were going to submit it to the temple, they would have verified it. And I agree that that would be a wonderful thing if everybody verified the information that they put in Family Tree and shared with the temple. But the truth is, as we look at the data, we see that that's simply not true. So these are both myths. And the truth is, there is no guarantee of accuracy for the names in Family Tree. And so some of you might be saying, but doesn't Family Tree check for errors? Like, I know I've seen errors, messages about errors on the person page. And that is absolutely right. Family Tree does some very simple checking of 2 basic categories of problems. One is that they do check for likely possible duplicates, but probably a lot of us have had the experience of Family Tree not finding all the duplicates there are to find. I found many duplicates manually, and that is actually not a problem with Family Tree, it's a problem with the data. So Family Tree tells if 2 things are duplicates by seeing if they have a lot of information in common. But an example of duplicates that don't have information in common would be a child that's only connected to its parents and nothing else, no sibling, no spouse, no children. And doing the research could tell that it's a duplicate. And the other thing that Family Search checks is certain categories of logic errors, such as a child born after a parent's death. But even then, we are responsible for determining how to solve those errors. In this example, the case of a child being born after the father's death, how do we know what the problem is? Is the child's birth date wrong? Did someone put in a typo and the child was really born 10 years earlier before the father died? Or is the father's death date wrong? Has there been a bad merge and somehow a bad death date got put on this person and he really didn't die? And this kid really was his and really was born at the right time. So Family Search will call out these logic errors to us, but it's up to us to do the due diligence and the sanity checking to figure out how to solve those errors. And just in case you're interested in a list of all the errors that are flagged in Family Tree, see this Help Center article. It's called What Are All the Possible Data Problems in Family Tree? And last I checked, there were like 31 or 32 different errors, and they're all this type of thing: a child born after the father's death, a mother having children when she's too young and couldn't possibly have the child, or when she's too old. That one's a little more iffy because sometimes women do have children after what we would consider typical childbearing years. But all the errors are these types of logic errors that Family Search will call out to us. And while these are wonderful and we always want to address these problems and deal with these errors to improve quality, Family Search does not catch all errors. Family Tree doesn't. Here's a list of the errors that I've noticed that Family Tree does not flag. For instance, it will not alert you if there's an incorrect merge. It won't alert you if there are incorrect relationships. And I should backtrack a little on the incorrect merge thing. If you're remerging somebody that's been unmerged and remerged a number of times, you will get a warning, but there's nothing right on the person page where Family Search says, hey, this person might have a bad merge on them. We as users have to do that determination ourselves. Um, Family Search does not flag incorrect relationships. What would be an example of that? A child connected to the wrong parents, where maybe that child did, or excuse me, that those parents did have a child by that name, but somebody got the kids mixed up and they joined a child of the same name to the wrong parents. Family Search or Family Tree also does not flag errors like a christening that happens before a birth or children born before a marriage. They also don't flag information that contradicts sources or even contradictory sources. These are all things as users of Family Tree that we need to check out, that we're responsible for checking on. So checking accuracy is up to us. So that leads us to best practice number 2, which is to enter solid information. What exactly do I mean by that? Here are some guiding principles for entering solid information. This might seem a little bit odd, but I've noticed that it makes a big difference. And that is to be intentional, set a specific goal, and then look for information to help you with that goal. One of the times that I found that users get into trouble is when they say, I'm just going to get in Family Tree and poke around. And somebody did that on one of my lines, and they ended up seeing some duplicate hints which weren't turned out not to be right. So they merged a bunch of duplicates, which caused more wrong hints, more bad relationships, and so forth. The end result was about 30 bad merges over 3 generations. And that wouldn't have happened, I don't think, if the person had had a goal instead of just randomly going into Family Tree and seeing what they could find. Because the reason that they did all those bad merges and the reason it spread so much was because they didn't know those families. They had not done any research on the families. They just kind of went in and said, well, yeah, let's see what we find. Let's do whatever. So we definitely want to be intentional and even prayerful about the goals that we want to set for our research. Another huge one is don't assume. That is good advice in any area of life, right? Don't assume. Ask questions. Instead, ask questions and look for evidence. The next thing is strive for completeness and accuracy in the information that you're going to enter in Family Tree. That has become so much easier. In the olden days, we had to write away to courthouses or overseas, or we had to go down to the Salt Lake Library and scroll through rolls and rolls of microfilm till our arms were sore. Now we click a button, like we click the Ancestry logo on the person page, and it runs a search in Ancestry, and we get all this information at our fingertips. Honestly, it is so much easier to be complete and accurate than it ever was in the past, and I expect it to just keep getting better and better. Also, it's always a good idea to organize and verify information before entering it in Family Tree. I can't tell you how many times that I like to use a tool called the timeline grid. And if any of you are interested in that, maybe put a question in the chat and I can supply a link. But it's basically just a table that helps you organize your information. So many times, you guys, when I've been gathering information before putting it in Family Tree, I've put it in the table in the timeline grid. And because I've done that, I've noticed problems like, wait, there's a huge gap between these children. Or wait, this wife in the 1881 census, her name is still Emma, but now she's 10 years older and she's born in a different place. And come to find out, she's actually the second wife with the same name, or any number of different things like that. But I've just found it so valuable to get all your ducks in a row, organize and verify the information before you put it into Family Tree, and even search for duplicates before you start entering it so that you're not adding new people that are already in there. The other huge thing, once you've attached the people, or excuse me, once you've added the people, be sure to attach sources. And again, this is just my personal recommendation, but I strongly recommend attaching the Family Search historical records version of a source, if at all possible. So all the big genealogy sites have a lot of duplicate records. Duplicates maybe not the right word, but they have the same records that they make available to their users. Censuses are a good example. Every major genealogical site has US and English censuses. So if I find, okay, so why do I make this recommendation? It's because Family Search pretty much guarantees that if you attach one of the sources from Family Search historical records, the link will not break. Why can they do that? Because they own historical records. And so they can change the links in the background, or they can, manage the data in whatever way is appropriate not to break the links. And so that is a huge benefit. No other genealogy site makes that promise, and they shouldn't have to. It's not their job to create links that never break. But Family Search, because Family Tree is expected to last for decades and decades to come, and possibly into the millennium in some form or another. Who knows if it'll still be called Family Tree? But we're in this for the long haul, you guys, right? With doing family history, we're trying to we're trying to build a complete tree of the human family, and so that's just it. Family Search is in this for the long haul. They're not going away, and they want to make things as accurate as possible. So they're going to do everything they can to make sure those source links don't break. But if you can't find a certain record in Family Search historical records, then by all means attach it from another site, and be sure to include enough information that if the link breaks, somebody could still find that record on the other site. Because sources are so important. Again, in this shared environment where we're working together on a shared tree, we've got to show other people that we've done our due diligence and that we have a good reason for the information we've put in Family Tree. And the capstone, I would say, is keep learning. All of us are going to make mistakes, right? We're not perfect. But if we keep learning, we're going to keep getting better and better. I wanted to address a very common false assumption that really has an impact on entering solid data in Family Search Family Tree. And that is something that I like to call the same name trap. That is assuming that two different people in Family Tree are the same person just because they have the same name. So here's an example that actually was on my tree some years back. I have an ancestor named Andel, and she was born in the 1800s in England. Here's another Andel. She's the mother of 5 children. Are they the same person? Well, somebody thought they were. And so they merged this Andel and they added the 5 kids to my Andel, my relative. Well, I got in there, and to be honest with you, when I saw it, I was kind of excited. I was like, wow, this is awesome. Somebody else found some kids that I didn't know about. I can't wait to find out more. Well, as I looked at these kids that nobody had ever heard of before, guess what? They were born in the 1500s. So they were from extracted christening records. And it turned out that obviously, if she is the mother of children born in the 1500s, she cannot possibly be the same person as my Andel born in the 1800s. So these two people were not the same person. And you now, when I explain it that way, it's really obvious, right? You go, well, of course they're not the same person. How could anybody mix those people up? But the thing is, honestly, probably all of us have fallen into this trap at some time or another, where we just don't prove things out carefully enough. Maybe we see that they've got the same name and there's a few other details, and we think, okay, I'm justified in thinking these two people are the same, but they really end up not being the same. So, how do we avoid those types of false assumptions? I don't know of any better principle to follow than this one. Use what you know to discover what you don't know. That means that you're going on facts and not assumptions. Here's an example. I was working on Henry Collier. He was born in 1826 in London, England, and according to his christening record, his father is Benjamin Collier, and he's a jeweler. Thank goodness, because London is a big place, and a jeweler is a unique occupation. If he had been something else like, well, he wouldn't have been this in London, but in other areas, we've got miners and agricultural laborers, and many, many people have those occupations. So the occupation might not necessarily distinguish somebody who's a miner or who's an ag laborer. But in this case, we've got some pretty good information that Benjamin is a jeweler working in London. Well, Henry does not have a spouse in Family Tree. So I'm going to look for a spouse, and I find a couple of marriage records. I first find the record of Henry Collier and Sarah Bell. They're married in 1853 in London, so it's a reasonable time frame and a reasonable place. Now, if I had a tendency to fall into the same name trap, a manifestation of that would be, oh, the first source I find, if it looks pretty good, I'm just going to assume it's right, and I'm going to add Sarah Bell as Henry's wife. Well, guess what? When I poked around a little bit more, we've got a marriage of Henry Collier and Mary Ann Fenner in 1849 in London, England. Again, a reasonable year considering when Henry was born. So which one's right? Can I tell by looking at this? Well, if we fall into the same name trap, we would say, yes, we can tell because obviously it's Henry. And oh, yeah, he's from London. So maybe I just pick the first one I find or whatever. But let's talk about using this principle, use what you know to discover what you don't know. We do know that Henry's father is Benjamin, the jeweler, and most marriages in England at this time will list the father. So we look at the image, and guess what we find out on this record? This Henry, his dad's name is also Henry, and he's a coach builder. And then we look at the other one and look what we find. His dad is Benjamin Collier, a jeweler. So we can be very confident that this is not the right spouse for our Henry, and this one is the right spouse. And the way that we determined that was that we used what we knew to discover what we didn't know. We used the information of Benjamin as the dad being a jeweler to find out who Henry's wife was. There, along with recommending entering solid information, there are also some practices that you want to avoid when entering information in Family Tree. A very common one, and again, this is often done because people haven't learned what a problem it can be, but you want to avoid, if at all possible, entering names based on just one source, such as a census. The reason for that is that records are error prone, especially the census. And I found so many names in Family Tree that were entered based on just a census or just a birth record or whatever that turned out to be wrong because, the census taker got the age wrong, got the name wrong, got spelled it differently, whatever it might be. And sometimes there will be cases, especially with very, very early records, maybe in the 1600s, where you really don't have a choice. And if you don't have a choice, then you use what you've got, right? But in like the 1800s and 1900s, we have so many good records right at our fingertips that it is almost never necessary to rely just on one source. Relying on just a single source is generally asking for trouble. And it's not a responsible thing to do in a shared family tree. Now, it would be fine in your own tree, right? In your private tree, because you could note the information that you wanted to prove it later on, make sure that it's correct, and then you could look up other sources. But in a shared tree, you want to avoid that type of entry. Another thing that we want to avoid is entering disconnected people. And by that, I mean people with no relationships whatsoever. Why is that a problem? Well, because the relationships give the person context. They're actually how we identify people. We identify them not just by dates and places, but by their relationships. And that is actually how the duplicate algorithm works in Family Search, or it's one of the things that is considered as relationships, and also the source hints are they're based on relationships. So when we throw disconnect or put disconnected people in the tree, just a random person with no parents, no spouse, no children, no siblings, no nothing, then if somebody else comes along and happens to find that person, they're not going to know a whole lot about them. So they're going to have to try and figure out what you were thinking by putting that person in with little or no context. And chances are very high if you enter a disconnected person that either there's a duplicate already in Family Tree actually that you didn't find because they were disconnected, or that somebody else will come along and not realize who that person really is, and so they'll create a duplicate of that person. I have really been trying hard to think of when you'd have a good reason for entering a disconnected person, and it's really hard to think of a circumstance when that would be a good thing to do in a shared tree. So I would definitely recommend avoiding entering disconnected people unless you have a really, really strong reason and you're going to try and go back and fix that. You're going to try and find and add those relationships. Here's another one that I've heard from a couple of people. We don't, they've actually advocated it, and I'm going to go the opposite direction and say, I don't believe it's a good practice to enter unverified information to quote, see what comes up. One day I was talking to a friend and I said, and she did family history. And so I said, I've been looking for this information. I think it was for on my Gunton line for Susanna Gunton or someone. I said, I'm just not having much luck finding this, I think it was, shoot, trying to remember back now, I think it was a marriage record. And I said, I just haven't had much luck finding this information. And she said, well, just put in what you have and see what comes up in Family Tree. The trouble with that advice is that it assumes that Family Tree is some kind of a magic genie that can supply facts based on inaccurate information. So yes, I could have estimated or put in suppositions, but if I'd done that, I would basically be getting self-confirming evidence, right? I would be, Family Search would give me hints that match the information that I put in. So of course it's going to confirm that information because that's what I put in. There's the old principle that developers and computer programmers, as they were called in the old days, would talk about, and it's called GIGO, garbage in, garbage out. And it basically just means if you give a computer system bad information, that's exactly what it's going to give you back. And it's true in Family Tree. And sometimes I know this is somewhat of a common misconception because I've heard a number of people say it, where they somehow assume that even if we put incorrect information in Family Tree is somehow going to know and going to supply good record hints or good duplicates or true duplicates or right information or whatever. As we said earlier, Family Search will catch certain errors, a limited number of about those 31 or 32 errors, but they also do not catch a lot of errors. And so we want to avoid that practice of just entering in whatever your best guess or your unverified information, expecting Family Tree to come up with valid information in return. So that all being said, I'm a strong advocate, as you've probably gathered, of being careful and accurate, but it can go too far. We can sometimes, if people tell us to be accurate, we can start getting paralyzed by perfection. And I don't want anybody to walk away from this webinar feeling that way. So I like to think of accuracy along a continuum. On one end, we've got someone who's completely careless, doesn't care. They're just going to throw whatever in Family Tree. They just want to check it off their list. Maybe they don't really like family history. They just want to, you know, complete that task and not feel guilty about it anymore. On the other end of the continuum, we have perfection, which is none of us, with the possible exception of the persona of Michelle, who's that we saw in the persona page of a professional genealogist. Her stuff is wonderful. But most of us, myself included, are not there. So it doesn't really serve us well to beat ourselves up if we're not perfect or to aim for an impossible goal. My personal feeling is we've got to be easy on ourselves and not like beat ourselves up if we're not perfect, but we also don't want to go over to the careless end. So what we're looking for is what my friend Susan at Family Search calls the sweet spot. We want to do our best, be careful, fix mistakes, and learn and grow. And we want to be moving towards perfection. Notice that we're closer to perfect than careless. But again, we're tolerant of our own mistakes and we're tolerant of other users. So there's that balance, right? We try to do our best, we move towards perfection, but we're not obsessed and insane about it. I hope that makes sense. Okay, the third one, we're on the third of 5, is to slow down. This GIF always cracks me up. So when we rush, we very often end up in a mess like this. Not just in family history, but in many areas of our life. Have you ever tried to cut corners in some way only to have things totally get messed up? And in the end, you ended up spending more time to fix your mistake than you would have if you had just slowed down and done it right in the first place. I think all of us can relate to that, right? So it's important to remember when we're doing family history that it's not a race and it's not a numbers game. Our self-worth doesn't rise if we put a greater number of names in the tree than somebody else. We don't have to do it faster than other people. It's in my mind, it's way more important to connect with your family and to enjoy what you're doing rather than turning it into a race or comparing with other people. And I will tell you that I have observed over the years in multiple scenarios that quickly adding large numbers of unverified names to family tree always adds incorrect information. There's just no way around it. And this, I'll give you an example. One, like this was 2 or 3 years ago, one of my friends, um, to her shock, she found her husband had died in their home. She walked in the room and he had passed away. And she was just devastated, obviously. She had also just gone into Family Tree and noticed that somebody had done a huge, we never figured out, was it a Jedcom upload or what it was, but they had added literally hundreds of names, of invalid names to Family Tree. And she was madly trying to resolve these names because people were doing temple work off them. And she was in the middle of this when she learned that her husband had passed away. So the reason I even bring that all up is that she asked if, or actually when I found out, I said, is there anything I can do to help you? I'm so sorry for your loss. And she said, yeah, actually, can you help me resolve these hundreds of duplicates? So I got in the tree and worked with her and worked, while she was away at the funeral and so forth, worked on resolving those duplicates. And the errors that were added through that mass contribution were just astonishing. There were all kinds of duplicates, wrong birth information, all kinds of stuff. And so that I learned firsthand that when we add, especially when we rush to add large numbers of names to Family Tree, there's basically no way to escape adding invalid information. Doesn't mean everything is invalid, but there's going to be errors and problems in there that we really don't want to be adding to a shared tree because it impacts other users. So one way it impacts other users is when we add that incorrect information, it leads to bad merges and to bad relationships. So people being joined to parents that aren't really their parents and so forth. And the trouble is in a shared tree, especially where we've got family search algorithms giving us hints and duplicate source hints and duplicate hints, then bad information spreads and multiplies. So I've noticed this on many occasions, once a bad merge is done, Family Search will dish up incorrect hints. Is that Family Search's fault? No, it's because there's been a bad merge and Family Search is just relying on the information on that person page to dish up the hints, the duplicate hints and the source hints. So it's a very good idea in a shared tree to be slow and deliberate. There is no reason to rush and to add hundreds or even thousands of names without carefully verifying them first. So my advice is slow down and enjoy the journey of discovery. Another thing that I strongly recommend is to keep a good backup. There isn't one right way to do that, but as you've seen, the data in Family Tree can be changed by other users, and I have had more than one occasion where I've put good information in, and then somebody has come in and has done a bad merge or has added bad information, and thank goodness I had a backup. So there are pros and cons to every option for backing up. I'll just list three for your consideration. One is to use a desktop program like Roots Magic or Ancestral Quest. Keep your private tree there, but then also take advantage of the shared tree and family tree. Another option is to use a website like ancestry.com or myheritage.com, where you can put your information and have it be your private tree. And then finally, another thing you can do is to use your research logs as a backup so that if you ever find that information is corrupted, you'll have documentation that will allow you to quickly and easily restore that. Well, it's not always quick and easy, but at least you'll have the documentation that will allow you to restore the correct information. And finally, we are to our final best practice for working in the shared family tree, and that is to follow the golden rule. Always think about how your actions will affect others. I'll have to admit to you, there are times when I just am tired and I do not want to add all those sources I've found. And I have to stop and think, what impact is that going to have on other users? How are they going to know that this information is correct if I don't take time to add the sources that I've found? And especially if I had a hard time finding the source. For instance, maybe in the census, the family was indexed incorrectly, and it took me ages and some really crazy searching to finally find that family in the census. So always think when you're working in Family Tree, always think about how your actions will affect others. And don't do things that you wish others wouldn't do. Be willing to collaborate with others. And bottom line, do your best to contribute reliable information to Family Tree. So that brings us to the end of our webinar. We talked about what a shared tree is, some things we need to understand about working in a shared tree, particularly where the data comes from, and then the five best practices five best practices. I shouldn't say the five best, they were the for this webinar, but five best practices that you can apply when working in FamilySearch Family Tree. So I thank you so much for joining us for this webinar today. And Anna, do we have questions that we need to answer?
Yes, we have a couple. So one question is, if another family tree user has added the 4 children of a first wife as children of my ancestors, the second wife, would it be better to add the facts of the second marriage date in the discussion session and encourage them to make the necessary changes rather than just to make the changes myself?
Oh my goodness, that is such a good question, and it captures the spirit of Family Tree. Thank you so much. The whole reason that Family Search provides Family Tree for us is to collaborate. And so I will usually look at who made the changes and see if I can get in touch with them or who did the incorrect information. If I can get in touch with them, I'll send them a message and say something like, hey, I noticed that you had added these children, and you always want to be very gracious and not accusatory. But and I'm sure you would have done that anyway. But you say something like, I noticed you added these children, but I have some birth records that show that they're actually the kid of the second wife. And would you like to jump on a Zoom call sometime and talk about that? Or would you like me to share these things with you? And just kind of try to open up a dialogue. And once you've opened up the dialogue, you can ask them, would you rather make the change or would you like me to change it? My sister had a situation like that where she contacted the person and just, was so gracious. And she said something like, I noticed that you'd contributed such and such information, but as far as I can tell, this other information is correct. I'd love to hear what you think. And the person wrote back and said, oh my goodness, you're right. I'm so embarrassed and I'm so sorry. And my sister's like, no, 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 don't be embarrassed. We're working on our family together, not a big deal. And as I recall, the person said to my sister, why don't you go ahead and make the changes? And so then my sister did. So that's what I would advise there, is try to open a dialogue and then just collaborate with them on who will make the changes. If you try to reach them and they don't respond, or they respond angrily, then if they don't respond, I'd go ahead and make the changes. If they respond angrily, I would try to mend things if you can. Like a good apology is always appropriate. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to offend you. I'd love to work with you on this. But if they still are upset or angry, I'd use your best judgment. I would, oh goodness, especially if temple work is involved and you're going to be doing temple work, you want it to be accurate. And so you might just write back and say, I'm going to go ahead and make the changes and attach the documentation. And then if it just doesn't settle down and they're still very angry and they like you get into a tug of war. I've seen this happen where people, they make a change, somebody changes it back and the other person changes again. Then you can actually go to support and try to get help with dealing with that situation. But just know that if you do go to support, asking for help in a situation like that, they're going to ask you if you've tried to work with the other person first. So thank you for that great question.
Awesome, thanks. We have another question from Annette asking, how do you know when the names that you've entered are actually connected to the shared tree?
Oh, now that is a good question too, Annette. Thank you so much. That helps me understand that if I ever do this presentation again, I've got to explain it a little bit better. So the only thing there is in Family Tree is a shared tree. That's all. Like there's no individual trees in Family Tree. It's all one big place where we're building a shared tree. Now, that being said, according to Ron Tanner, he shared this in a Roots Tech talk. About a third of the 1.3 billion names in Family Tree are currently all joined together. And then the rest of the 2/3 are all in little fragments. And so our ultimate goal is to connect all those little fragments to the big tree so that ultimately we have just one big tree in Family Tree. And so, but that we're not there yet. But when I speak of shared tree, I guess it's more accurate to say I'm speaking of the place where we're building it. So Annette, I hope that helps. And thank you so much for asking that question to give me a chance to clarify. And you guys, if that still isn't clear, please ask a follow-up question and I'll be glad to try and explain better.
Awesome. We also have some people that requested the timeline grid link.
Oh, you bet. Let me exit out of the presentation and I got to move the little Zoom menu thing here. Let's go timeline grid. Let's see. Is that it? Nope, that's not it. Sorry, you guys, I was trying to go off my browser's memory. Let's go to, is that it? Let's try that. Nope, that's not it. Okay, there we go. That's the link. So I'm assuming you guys can still see my screen. I believe I shared it correctly, so hopefully you can still see it. And this page right here is just a place where I've posted some links to some webinars on how to use the timeline grid. And then down here, there are just different templates for both US research and then also for British research. So as probably a lot of you are aware, US censuses are done on the 0 years, like 1850, 1860. British censuses are on the 1 year, so 1861, 1871, etc. So the templates take that into account. And also the US template takes into account that the 1890 census got burned. So it actually doesn't have a column for the 1890 census. But anyway, that's the page with the information, and I will jump in the chat and change it to all attendees. And there you go, you guys, you should be able to see that link in the chat now. And I see there's a question in the Q&A. I'm going to go ahead and answer that. So Terrell asks, what are the percentages on the tree for who is connected and who is not? According to Ron Tanner, approximately 1/3, or as I recall, 465 million, if I'm remembering right, because I have this in another presentation. So about a third of the 1.3 billion total names are all connected in one big tree. And the other 2/3 are all in little tree fragments. Again, that's according to Ron Tanner from a Roots Tech presentation. So Terrell, thank you for asking that question. Anna, do we have any other questions in the chat?
Yep, just one more. Carol asked if there is a handout associated with this presentation.
Oh, that's a good question. And you know what? I stopped giving handouts because they get out of date like 5 minutes after the presentation. So I'll tell you what I always do is share the link to the presentation. So I have just grabbed the link and I will go ahead and put that in the chat. And this is a link to the slide deck. Wait, it's not copying. Let me try again. I did paste and nothing happened. There we go. So there is a link to the slide deck that was used today, and this link will always work so that if I update this presentation, like correct errors or add information, you will always get the most recent version of the slide deck. So that's a really cool thing as far as Google Slides, that you've always got the most up-to-date thing. Okay, Anna, any more questions?
Nope, I think that's it. I'm going to share my screen now.
Okay.
Thank you so much for joining us today. We hope you will join us for our next webinar, which will be on July 21st on the effective use of the Allen County Public Library's Genealogy Center with Kurt Witcher. A recording of this webinar will be made available next week, and you can view that on our YouTube channel or our website. If you have any comments or questions, you can always email us at fhl_webinars@byu.edu or follow Facebook and Twitter. Thank you and have a wonderful week.